Hello folks, and welcome back to the MRS Hobby Store commission build on the 1970 Pontiac Firebird Revell kit. I think we've got everything cleaned up and ready for primer. Got the body all ready to go. A couple other things I wanted to show you. I've got all the other spare parts cleaned up. The engine block glued together, valve covers glued on. And I didn't really have to fill up the seam on this too much, so I just sanded it down. So we'll see after I prime it and sand it if there's still a seam visible. We'll revisit that later. But so far that looks pretty good. Just use a toothpick to hold it on there. And then the seats, got those glued together. Again, got the seams pretty well sanded up, so they're looking pretty good. Again, once we get primer on there and kind of get it sanded a little bit, that'll give us a really good indicator of how our seam lines are looking. So we'll revisit that later after we get that primed up as well. So if you're gonna take your parts off of the sprue, which I normally do, again, there's not really a good point to hold these on to spray them, so sometimes I'll leave these two larger pieces on the sprue. My smaller pieces I'll take off so I can get them cleaned up. And one thing I found really handy is these are just regular alligator clips from the hardware store, and I've just glued them onto hobby sticks, and they work really well to hold my little pieces to get them ready for paint. And if I don't have an attachment for an alligator clip, I will just use poster putty, hobby tack, whatever you want to call it. But I'll just use that, a little bit of that, put it on the stick without the alligator clip, and put my little pieces on there. And that seems to work really good for me as well, and holding my parts to get them all painted up. So I think we are finally ready for some primer. So let's go do that. So the primer I've been using the most lately is Stynal Res by Badger Airbrush Company. It's a water-based primer. It goes down really nice, very forgiving, very easy to work with. So I've been using this the most lately. Another advantage of using a double action airbrush is I can spray air across my surfaces just to remove any leftover dust before I start spraying. Alright, so we're back from priming, and we're still not ready for paint yet. Anytime you spray your primer on there, you'll want to go over it with a little bit of sandpaper just to give it a really smooth finish before the paint. One thing I have noticed about the Stynal Res is you can wet sand it very nicely, but you can also use sometimes I'll just use the Tamiya sanding sponges as well. And this is a 1500 grit. So we're just going to go across the entire body and get it nice and smooth. If you are planning on painting after this stage, you want to be careful not to burn through your primer. So be careful on your corners, edges. The sandpaper will burn through that primer really quickly. So just kind of give it a light scrub. So generally, it's really hard to see. In fact, it's almost impossible to see, but a lot of times around your seams, door jambs, things like that, this plastic will be raised slightly. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we take this primer back down to the plastic, you're starting to see that bulge be exposed. See the seam? that plastic is sitting higher than the rest of the body, and we want to smooth that back down to make it as level with the rest of the car as possible. So another way we can do that is with wet sandpaper, wet dry sandpaper. This is a 2000 grit, and this is just automotive grade wet dry sandpaper. The water kind of acts as a lubricant, so it kind of helps keep the sanded off primer out of the way so you can keep sanding. Because a lot of times with the sanding sticks and the sanding sponges, the primer will kind of build up in the grooves in your sanding medium, whereas the water kind of helps to keep that out of the way. All right, so since that's some pretty good differences there, I'm going to actually go a little bit more aggressive, or a lot more aggressive. This is an 800 grit sandpaper, and we're really going to start leveling that out more. So I've switched back to my finer sandpaper, back to my 2000 grit, now that I'm not trying to actually knock the plastic down to level it out. I'm just trying to level out my primer, so I'm going back to a less aggressive sandpaper, more for smoothing. All right, so I'm pretty much done with that sanding. Just got back from the sink, got it all washed off. Cleaned up again. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm using my primer as a guide coat to see, you can see, even though it looks pretty flat, when you start sanding it down, you can see your high and low spots by using that primer as a guide coat. All right, and we can see, I noticed this as I was inspecting it before I started sanding. You can see with the primer as a guide coat, it really brings that out, but you can see I've got a little scratch there where I bumped my scriber and scribed into my body. As I've said before, that happens. I've got a little bit more right here. I didn't sand that down enough, so you can't really see it. But I've got a couple of other minor scratches that I'll be filling those in with my Mr. Surface 500 and sanding those off, and that'll take care of those for me. So I'll get that finished up, sanded down, and ready for another coat of primer. Done with our primer, so we just need to sand that down a little bit more just to smooth it off to give us a good finish for our paint. And to do that, I'm just going to use my 1500 grit sanding sponge from Tamiya. I'm sure by now some of you have noticed I wear a glove only on one hand. The reason for that is because I'm right-handed, and as you can see, my right hand is my working hand, which means my left hand is my holding hand. I don't want to get any of my oils from my skin onto my projects, especially when I'm getting ready to paint. It becomes even more important if you're going to move on to a clear coat that you have a contaminant-free surface. So again, the goal here is to just provide a smooth finish for our paint. I'm not going to take this down to the plastic again, so I want to be careful not to burn through any of the primer. So I'm just using light pressure and just letting the sandpaper do all the work. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do I get such a nice finish? And I say, with a nice start. And by that I mean, you can see how much work goes into the project before I even start getting paint on it. And the nicer your product is prior to painting, the nicer of a finish you will get. So all the work that you put into prepping your car before paint will pay off in the long run. All right, I'm gonna go get this washed off at the sink, just to remove any leftover dust, get it dried off, and then we'll be ready for paint. And once again, we'll be using the Tamiya XF8, the flat blue. Again, I mix this at a 1-to-1 ratio with the Tamiya thinner. 1-to-1 just means 1 part paint and 1 part thinner. I'll use that, I'll thin that down because this is way too thick to spray through an airbrush right out of the bottle. All right, so let's go do that. So I know I said we were ready for paint, and we are sort of, but I forgot I was going to paint the engine bay black, and I went ahead and painted the headliner as well, and the underside of the engine bay, shock towers, things like that. Went ahead and painted that black. I forgot I wanted to do that first, so that way I can mask off the engine bay. Decided to try to paint a little bit of the underside of the hood. So this is going to go in the dryer, and then we'll do some other things. Like maybe we'll get the rest of the other parts cleaned up, and maybe I'll show you how to de-chrome some parts to get those ready as well. So I've decided to take all the chrome off with the exception of the rear view mirrors. And to do that, I'm just going to use heavy duty oven cleaner that I picked up at the grocery store. And even though I have it sped up, you can see it doesn't take long to take that chrome off. So I'm going to be painting the black parts with Tamiya semi-gloss black mixed at a 1-to-1 ratio with Tamiya acrylic thinner. So with a quick spray check on my glove to double check my consistency, we can start painting. Alright, so we're out of the dryer. Hopefully that paint's dried up enough. And let's get it masked up and ready for some blue paint. So to do that, I'll be using my Tamiya masking tape. I've got the two sizes, the 6mm and the 18mm. So again, almost all of these products, items that I'm using, you can purchase at MRS Hobby. They do have an online store as well. I want to get this thing secured up, top and bottom. So let's start doing that. All right, let's go paint this thing. All right, we've got 2 coats on it. And as you saw, as I was spraying the hood, it flipped off my clip, and fell down into the dried up paint, got a little bit of dust on there. So I decided to stop right there, kind of let everything dry up for a little bit. And then we can get this hood cleaned up. There's just a little bit of dust and stuff in the corners. You can see there some white on there. If the camera will pick that up. Just a little bit of dust around the edges and stuff. So we're just gonna lightly clean that off, and then we'll go back and get the third and final coat on there. Just double check our body since we have it in here. I noticed a couple little dust specks that had fallen into the paint while I was painting it. So since we're stopping and letting everything dry, we might as well take a minute to just inspect and make sure everything's coming out nicely. Just to make sure there's nothing that we need to correct before we get it back on the stand and get another coat of paint on it. All right, I'm happy with that. Back to the spray booth. All right, we've got our last coat of paint on there. It's looking pretty good. I went ahead and sprayed the scoop white as well, so that's ready. So let's get some clear coat on there so we can get a nice smooth layer for our decals to lay on. And for that, we're going to be using our Tamiya Clear X22. So back to the spray booth. Alright, so we've got our clear coat on there. It's looking pretty good. It's going to need some work. There's quite a bit of little dust specks and speckles in it that we'll need to polish out, but all in all, that looks pretty good. So we'll get ready for some decals and start moving on to the next step. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.